Meteorologists are making increasing use of information provided on photo websites by ordinary people. There was a presentation dealing with how they do this at a recent conference in New York. Scientists based at a university in Indiana looked at thousands of photos of snow scenes posted online. These provided them with information about snowfalls in areas where, because of heavy cloud cover, no information from satellite photography was available. It is not necessary to make use of this source of information as far as urban weather is concerned, as there is usually easy access to plenty of other data about towns. But photos taken by the public can be an excellent way of filling in the gaps in knowledge about weather events in more distant rural locations.
A manakin is an unusual type of bird found in the tropical forests of Colombia and Ecuador. Approximately 20 of the 40 different types of manakin make a kind of music by moving their body parts. This is particularly done by the male bird when it is hoping to attract a female. Although ornithologists had long been aware that the bird somehow managed to make its characteristic noise with its wings, they were unable to work out exactly how the sound was produced. However, a postgraduate student has recently solved the puzzle. She did so by recording the bird's movements with a camera operating at a speed of 1,000 frames per second. A standard camcorder records about 30 frames per second. On examining the footage, she was able to see that the bird used one special feather to click against other feathers, in much the same way as guitarists use a plectrum to pluck the strings of their instrument.
A number of global forces have gradually, sometimes almost clandestinely, altered the world as we know it. The most visible to most of us has been the increasing transformation of everyday life by cell phones, personal computers, email, Blackberries, and the Internet. The exploration after World War II of the electronic characteristics of silicon led to the development of the microprocessor, and when fiber optics combined with lasers and satellites revolutionized communication capacities, people from Pekin, Illinois, to Peking, China, saw their lives change. A large percentage of the world's population gained access to technologies that I, in setting out on my long career in 1948, could not have imagined, except in the context of science fiction.
The obvious advantage of having printed text and visual images together on one sheet was quickly grasped by monks, who saw its potential as a means of spreading knowledge, and as an economic and effective way to get their message across to a wide audience. The monasteries, however, by no means had a monopoly on the production and sale of woodcut printing. In fact, probably the most profitable area of European printmaking was the production of playing cards. Nonetheless, the content of most surviving block books is essentially biblical. The purpose of the illustrations was functional: to make the meaning of the stories as clear and as understandable as possible to those who were unable to read the often difficult text. It was also a result of the need to popularize the stories that the characters were presented in contemporary clothes and the illustrations contained details of ordinary life in the late Middle Ages.
Umami was first identified in Japan, in 1908, when Dr. Kikune Ikeda concluded that kombu, a type of edible seaweed, had a different taste than most foods. He conducted experiments that found that the high concentration of glutamate in kombu was what made it so tasty. From there, he crystallized monosodium glutamate, MSG, the seasoning that would become popular the world over. Decades later, umami became scientifically defined as one of the 5 individual tastes sensed by receptors on the tongue. Then in 1996, a team of University of Miami researchers studying taste perception made another breakthrough. they discovered separate taste receptor cells in the tongue for detecting umami. Before then, the concept was uncharted. Up until our research, the predominant wisdom in the scientific community was that umami was not a separate sense. Global climate change is the greatest environmental challenge we face. We have at most a few decades to make the necessary investments to prevent the most serious impacts of climate change. Future generations will judge us based on the investments we are considering now. In its February 2007 report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, warns that global emissions must peak no later than 2015 if we are to hold average global temperature increases to 2.4 degrees Celsius, 4.3 degrees Fahrenheit, or less. Moving to an emissions pathway that will hold temperature increases to a minimum will require a colossal effort. There is no time to lose given the long lag in research and development cycles, and energy-intensive infrastructure and product turnover. Fundamentally, altering the world's energy system is unlikely to occur within this timeframe. Evidence for a genetic basis of antisocial behavior stems from several different lines of research. First, behavioral genetic studies of twins and adoptees have demonstrated that heredity plays a role in antisocial behavior, including various forms of aggression and criminality, by finding greater concordance for such behavior in genetically related individuals, compared to non-relatives living in the same environment. Second, various correlates of antisocial behavior, including personality factors such as impulsivity, sensation-seeking, risk-taking, and callous unemotional traits, are known to be at least partly genetically influenced. Third, psychiatric outcomes related to antisocial behavior, including antisocial personality disorder, gambling, and substance use and abuse, have also been investigated in genetically informative designs, and each of these has demonstrated significant genetic links.
In prehistoric times, Europe was covered with vast primeval woods and forests, which must have deeply influenced the minds as well as the lives of our ancestors. In places where they had not made clearings, they must have jived in a constant half-light. As far as we know, the oak was the commonest and most useful tree. We get our evidence partly from the statements of some classical writers, but more convincingly from the remains of ancient villages built on wooden piles in lakes and from the oak forests which have been found embedded in peat bogs. These bogs, which are most evident in northern Europe, but which are also found in some central and southern parts of the continent, have preserved the plants and trees which flourished after the end of the Ice Age.
Computer viruses have been a fact of life at least since the 1980s, if not before. They can cause companies to lose hours of working time, and they can also spread panic among computer users everywhere. There are, however, several distinct types of computer infection, all loosely referred to as viruses, and they each work in a slightly different way. A particularly nasty one is the worm, which is a program designed to sneak its way into an entire computer network and reproduce itself over and over again. Then there is the Trojan, which strictly speaking isn't a virus, but a piece of software that appears to do one thing, but actually does something malicious instead. When the unsuspecting operator introduces it into the computer, the alien program will take over the machine. With Trojans you have to be particularly careful because they can often be introduced by way of a message advertising an antivirus product. So what motivates someone to introduce a virus into the computer systems of innocent victims? Perhaps it's simply the desire to prove that it can be done. Also in the 20th century, another famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, dreamed up a perfect city that got no further than the drawing board. Wright believed that what was wrong with modern cities was, in his words, rent. Ideas, land, even money itself, had to be paid for. He saw this as a form of slavery and believed that modern city dwellers had no sense of themselves as productive individuals. Thus, Wright's city was to be made up of numerous individual homesteads, and the houses themselves were to be simple, functional and in harmony with the environment. Everyone would own enough land to grow food for himself and his family. No outsiders would be allowed to come between the citizen and what he produced, or to exploit both for money. Goods and services would all be exchanged, not bought and sold for profit.
Conservationists have long debated whether the koala should go on the Australian National Threatened Species List. While the koala is clearly in trouble in some parts of the country, in Queensland, for example, high numbers are afflicted by disease. In other parts such as Victoria and South Australia, the problem is not that koala populations are falling, but that they have grown to the point where they are almost too numerous. For a species to be classed as vulnerable, its population must have decreased by more than 30% over the last 3 generations or 10 years. The problem is that when such a stipulation is applied to koalas, the Victorian boom offsets the Queensland bust, and the species stays off the list. This has repercussions because northern koalas are different to southern ones. They are smaller, for example, and they contain a genetic variation not represented in the south. For this reason, a split listing has been devised. Koalas from New South Wales, the ACT and Queensland are now officially vulnerable. Those from Victoria and South Australia are not considered threatened.
A recent study reveals that the ability to walk quickly in old age is an indicator of a long life. The report examined results from recent research. The participants in the research were tested on a regular basis over an extended period of time. The researchers focused on the relationship between walking speed in the post-65 age group and longevity. They concluded that there was a direct correlation between walking speed and lifespan. A key researcher gave the explanation that this link exists because walking involves the use of many bodily functions working in unison. The heart, lungs, skeletal system, joints, muscles, nerves and brain have to work together in order to ensure a consistent speed. Damage to any of these systems may mean a much slower walking speed, which could signal medical problems.
One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, how much of the news is biased? Can we recognize bias? The fact is, despite the journalistic ideal of objectivity, every news story is influenced by the attitudes and background of its interviewers, writers, journalists, photographers and editors. That is not to say that all bias is deliberate, but it does exist. So how can we, as readers or viewers, determine bias? Well, in the case of newspapers, it manifests itself in a number of ways, such as what events are selected for inclusion or omission. The placement of the article, meaning its proximity to the front or back pages, is significant. The use of headlines, photographs and language are further examples.
Lyrebirds, a common bird in rainforest areas of Australia, have an incredible repertoire of sounds that they are able to mimic from their environment, including over 20 other bird calls as well as sophisticated mechanical sounds. They have been known to replicate the sounds of chainsaws and pneumatic drills. The male lyrebird sings a medley of mimicry to impress females, and the more detailed and varied his repertoire is, the more interesting it seems to potential mates. Like females of other bird species, female lyrebirds do not take place in the imitating, but simply judge the competing males' symphonies. Once learned, it seems a lyrebird rarely forgets a call, and the sounds are passed down through the generations. There are some lyrebirds in Victoria, Australia, that still recreate the sounds of axes, saws and old-fashioned cameras which have not been used in the area for years.